Good evening, everyone. My name is Silva Sheridan. Welcome to our webinar tonight. I work in the communications department with the Institute of Holistic Nutrition, and I'm a program advisor as well. It's just a pleasure to have each of you here this evening. I'm going to introduce our incredible panelist, our instructor extraordinaire, Kathrin Brunner. Kathrin is a Toronto-based nutritionist, health educator, and a Pilates and yoga teacher. She has a passion for holistic living and loves to share that in the clinic, the classroom, and the studio. Kathrin holds a degree in psychology and is a 2012 graduate of the Institute of Holistic Nutrition. She is the co-owner of For the Love of the Body and runs interactive workshops and events with an emphasis on hands-on learning. She teaches fermentation, soap making, and how to make natural skincare products and cleaning products. Kathrin teaches nutrition and the environment and the psychology of disease courses at the Institute of Holistic Nutrition's diploma program. And for tonight, she'll be teaching and giving you a great preview of her continuing education course, Fermentation Foundations, Traditions and Trends, which starts on November 3rd. So we're just so thrilled to have you here, Kathrin, tonight. And we look forward to hearing and learning from you.
Thanks so much, Selva, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you, and thank you for taking part. Tonight, we are going to be making a fermented Curtido recipe, which is a type of kraut. Some of you may be making it with me live. If you signed up late, you may not have your ingredients together, and that's totally okay. You will get the recipe card emailed to you, and once you have it and you've got your ingredients, you'll be totally good to go. For those of you who are going to be making it live with me, I've got some things laid out on the table. I'll take us through it. These are the materials and the ingredients that we'll need. Now, for those of you who are making it live with me, we'll do this step by step. And we'll pause at the end of each step for any questions that you might have about anything we've just done. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. Silva will read them out to me when we take that break between steps. And we'll make sure that everybody feels really comfortable before we move on to the next stage. In terms of what we've got laid out, I really like to keep things really minimal in terms of equipment. So know that if you've never fermented anything before, I'm sure you've got enough stuff in your kitchen already to be able to make this without having to buy additional things. So we have a bowl for putting our kraut into as we're making it, cutting board, and a knife. We'll be using the skin, the rind of our limes, as well as the juice, some kind of box grater or a zester to be able to do that. You could use a peeler and a knife in a pinch. The other things that I have laid out, I've got the jars that will hold the fermented Curtido. I really like using glass jars, which I'll explain why a little bit more when we get to this stage of putting our kraut in our jars. But any type of glass jar will work. You could be reusing a jar that you had your spaghetti sauce in. As long as you've cleaned it with hot water and soap, it's perfectly fine to use. I've got canning style mason jars. I really like the wide mouth if that's something that's an option to you, simply because it's a little bit easier for me to be able to get my hand into to tamp things down, which we'll be doing a little bit later on. Now, for those who are making things with me, you can grab your cabbage, and the way that we'll prep the cabbage is the age-old way of simply taking the outer peels, and those will be removed. So this is kind of how we clean or prep our cabbage. And those outer peels, I've just got an extra bowl here for the compost. Now, once you get the outer peels that may have been touched or that are discolored or anything like that, then you want to take another piece of the peel, and you could be doing this with your whole cabbage. I've just already cut mine. You're going to take a clean piece of the peel, and we're going to set that aside. We're going to use that later. So one clean piece of cabbage. Now, in terms of cabbages, for those who are going to be following along later, some things that I do like just to mention in terms of fermenting vegetables is we do still want to use vegetables that are fresh. When choosing a cabbage at the grocery store, you want to pick it up. Generally, cabbages that are heavier relative to other cabbages of similar size have more water content. It's an indicator that they're a little bit fresher. You also want to just look and make sure that there's not visible signs of mold or decay. If you're checking your cabbage out and there's got some like moldy or brown bits, you're just going to cut that away or remove it. For the cabbage, once we're ready and we've got the outer leaves discarded, and then we've got a couple clean leaves set aside, you're going to cut your cabbage in half from the root end or the stem end to the top. In terms of the size of the cabbage, I've got about a medium to large size of cabbage, which once I have my half, I'm going to just cut that. If you have a really humongous cabbage, then you might quarter it, cutting again between the stem towards the top of the cabbage. Once you've got your cabbage set up, now we're going to start to cut up our cabbage for the kraut. And in terms of cutting up the cabbage, it really is fermenter's choice. You could have bigger pieces of cabbage if you like. You could be chopping the cabbage up into bite-sized pieces. It is entirely up to you. If you've not made a fermented kraut before, I might recommend cutting it in thin, long strips. I find that it's a really friendly texture. It's also, I think, a nice way to eat the finished product, to have these fine, long strips. It makes it a little bit more versatile in terms of how you might serve it or how you might add it to other recipes, which I'll give you some serving suggestions at the end. And if you're curious kind of to see the size that I'm cutting to, I really am cutting it quite thinly. So I'm kind of making strips that are really just about, maybe a millimeter or two wide. I went ahead and cut half of my cabbage up just so that it wasn't so loud when we were doing this together. So if you're ready, go ahead and start to slice your cabbage with me. And I'm slicing it from the top of the cabbage down towards the stem end. And I'm just doing that very thinly. And as you slice your cabbage thinly, and again, you might be cutting through half of the cabbage, you might also be cutting through a quarter of the cabbage if it's really quite large. You're going to take your thin strips that you've sliced and you're going to start to add them to a large bowl. Now, I've already got half of my cabbage in the large bowl. And as you start to put the cabbage into the bowl, this is where we're going to start to add a little bit of sea salt. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about salt and which types of salts work best for fermentation, and I'll talk about general guidelines for how much salt to use. In general, I gave a very wide range of salt on your recipe card, and I did that intentionally. One is because it depends on the size of your cabbage. It also depends on the coarseness of your salt. A teaspoon of fine sea salt is much more salt than coarse sea salt, which is why I really like recommending salt to taste versus giving you an amount. I'm going to say that roughly for a medium-sized cabbage, you'll use at least a teaspoon of fine sea salt if that's what you're using. I've got half and a bit of my cabbage already in this bowl, which means I'm going to take a generous half a teaspoon of salt and I'm going to sprinkle it on top of that cabbage that I've already sliced. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about salt. I'm going to continue slicing so that I don't fall behind you who are making it live with me. For sea salt, I generally prefer to use pure sea salt that's unbleached and unprocessed. In terms of other types of salt, table salts and kosher salts will often have anti-clumping agents added to them. And sometimes those anti-clumping agents can inhibit fermentation. It won't entirely destroy it. I've done, so many ferment workshops where the venue has supplied salt and it's just random salt. I have no idea what it is. And it always works out, So if all you've got is processed table salt, don't worry, it will still work. But ideally, if you can choose your salt, an unprocessed sea salt works great. And that could be a Himalayan sea salt, could be Celtic, could be Redmond sea salt, whatever you've got nearby. Now, as you get more and more cabbage added to your bowl, you'll continue to sprinkle more sea salt in. And again, I'm going to say maybe a teaspoon total to start, and then we'll be able to get a sense of how much more we need to add in addition once we've been able to mix everything up and get a sense of the overall flavor. Now, for the salt has a couple purposes when we're fermenting vegetables. One is that it creates a more favorable environment for our fermenting microbes. And our big fermenting microbes when we're doing vegetables are the lactobacillus family of bacteria. And lactobacillus bacteria get their name because they make lactic acid. And so if you've had a fermented vegetable before, like a kraut, that tangy flavor that you're tasting, that acidic vinegary flavor, that's the lactic acid that's been accumulating and created during that ferment process. And the lactobacillus family of bacteria, we often call them lactic acid bacteria, or lab for short, which is things that you might see if you've ever sort of looked in recipes on fermentation. Now, our lab bacteria, they don't mind the high salt environment, but other types of yeast that would also like to eat the sugars in our cabbage, they don't like the salt quite as much. So it gives a favorable environment to our lab bacteria. The other thing that salt does is it actually helps to slow down enzymes that make for soggy vegetables. And I really like a bit of crunch in my ferments. I think it's a nicer texture. I also think it's nicer if you've only ever had, let's say, store-bought conventional krauts, like a Bic sauerkraut, which isn't even fermented, it's pickled, or even, I don't know, if you've only ever had like grandma's sauerkraut, no offense to grandmas, I love my grandmas, but if you only ever had like super old school traditional kraut, you might not be the biggest fan of it. I really love this kraut recipes because I think it's a great introduction to how diverse the flavors can be in krauts, how vibrant and tasty they can be, and leaving it a little bit crisp just makes it nicer on the palate. It makes it nicer to add to recipes later on, and a higher salt content will keep your vegetables a little bit more crispy. Now, I've got a bowl full of cabbage here, and I've got salt sprinkled throughout. Now, I'm going to start to move on to the next stage, which is beginning to massage our kraut, but I'll just do a basic check-in here and just see if there's any questions that have come up. Sylvan, maybe you can let me know if there's anything in the chat or the Q&A there.
Sure, there are currently no questions in the Q&A.
Yay! Awesome. Thank you so much for checking that for me. Okay, next stage, and no rush, so don't rush your chopping. But once you've got that bowl full of kraut and you've got your sea salt sprinkled in there, we're going to start to massage the cabbage. And this is literally the most important step of fermenting kraut. And kraut is a style of fermentation where we're using salt to pull the water out of the vegetable that you're fermenting. Typically it's cabbage, but you can also make cabbage-free krauts. One of my favorite krauts to make at this time of year uses squash, and you're just shredding or grating your squash and then sprinkling the salt in it at this stage. I really like adding curry flavors and orange. It's just absolutely delicious. And when we're doing this kraut style, what we want is for the salt to start to pull the water out of the vegetable so that it makes a brine. And brine just means salt water. And you can see, maybe for those of you who are watching and not making it with us tonight, you can see that my kraut, it's already getting a little translucent, like it's getting a little bit, not translucent, sorry, it's getting a little bit wet looking. And that's already the salt starting to pull the water out of the cabbage. And when we're doing this massaging, you want to use quite a bit of like force to do it. I think one of the kind of big missteps that might happen at this stage is that we do it really gently. Don't worry about swishing the cabbage. You're not going to ruin the texture. It'll still be crispy. But what we want to do is to use enough force so that we're really rubbing the salt into all of that surface area to start to pull the water out. And often I kind of use the idea of like, if your good friend has just come home from a really bad day and you were giving them some shoulder rubs, you wouldn't do like a dainty little, no one wants that after a bad day. You're going to get into their shoulders, and that's kind of the force that you want to use. And this stage of massaging our kraut isn't done until we have a puddle, a literal puddle of water at the bottom of our bowl. And what can tend to happen is we might rush this stage. And if you rush this stage and you don't actually have enough brine created, then you won't end up being able to create an oxygen-free or an anaerobic environment later on when we jar up the kraut to ferment. And that's really the key to making krauts safely and making krauts that aren't going to end up getting mold on the top. So know that if you've tried making a kraut in the past and you've gotten mold on it, there's a couple kind of big things that I'll just alert you to that are likely the reasons why. And don't be discouraged. Every single person who has fermented, who has become an expert fermenter, has dealt with mold. It's just going to happen. If you ferment, you will have a batch of something that gets mold on it. And even if you get mold, there's a strong likelihood that all is not lost. And I will talk about that later as well. Now, if you're massaging with me or when you're making this recipe, if you're not following along, you're going to notice that you really start to see quite a bit of water in the bottom of the bowl as you're massaging. So I'm not sure quite if that's like totally picking it up, but I'm actually able to like swirl a little puddle there. I think you kind of just see that there in the camera. And that's how much liquid that we want at the bottom, at least. Another way that you can also test it if you're making this is to lift up a little bit of kraut and squeeze, and you should have water running out of it. If you are not yet at the stage where you have water running out of it when you pick up a handful and squeeze, then you're not ready yet. Keep massaging, my friends, and think about the free workout that you're getting. Grip strength, forearms, it's like a free workout whenever we make kraut. Now, once you have the puddle of brine, now is a really good time to do a first taste test for salt level. I'm going to take a little piece of cabbage. Sorry, you can probably really hear that as I'm chewing. And I'm going to add a little bit more salt. When we are fermenting, we're not adding salt like we would to, let's say, if we were making this as a slaw recipe. You want it to be slightly saltier than how you would cook. And that's because the salt is going to end up being diluted into our brines. We also are going to be serving this kraut As a condiment, I mean, actually, who am I kidding? I like this kraut so much that I'm just going to eat it by the forkful, which I'm so excited that we're making this today because I'm running so low. I'm very excited to have another big batch. But, you know, traditionally when we're thinking about eating kraut, we're serving it as a side, or it's going on top or inside of something, which means that it's okay if it's slightly salty. Because that salt is doing a lot to help with that fermentation process, don't shy away from the salty flavor. And I'm going to try and take a little smaller piece so I'm not crunching that long in your ears. I'm going to do even more salt. Now, inevitably, you or maybe a client will have a question about, well, that seems like a lot of salt in ferment recipes. Now, again, it's a condiment. You're not eating a full bowl of this. You're eating a smaller amount. Second, of course, salt is essential to our diets. And if you're not eating a lot of processed foods, if you're eating mainly whole food cooking from scratch, like you do need to add quite a bit of salt in a day just to, you know, make up for the losses from sweating. And so we do want to have adequate salt in our diet. So there's no reason to fear salt. You can use substitutes in place of salt. You know, so it is possible, for example, to juice celery and use that liquid as brine and not use sea salt. However, your kraut will be more prone to mold. So unless somebody had a reason why they needed to minimize salt in their diet, add liberally, add to a pleasingly salty taste. Okay, once you've got that puddle of brine, you're happy with the way that the salt tastes. Now we're going to start to prep some of our other ingredients. Now in this recipe, we have shallot or red onion, we have lime, we have carrot, and we have some type of hot pepper. A chili pepper, a serrano pepper, a jalapeno pepper, they all work really well. You can use any of those. And I'm going to start to add the more stronger flavors first to allow them to marinate in the bowl so that I can get a sense of how the finished recipe will taste to know whether or not I want to add more or not. I'm going to start with the shallot. If you've got a red onion, just sort of based on the size, you can kind of think about how much you might want to add. If you've got a massive red onion, you might not be putting the whole thing in your recipe. So start with a hunk of your red onion, maybe like a quarter or so, or if you've got a shallot that's quite large, maybe just start with the half. And for the shallot, I'm going to mince mine into fairly small pieces. You could also, in place of mincing, you could also do sort of long, thin slices, also work really well. Again, fermenter's choice. If you've got something like a shallot, shallots do tend to be slightly milder than red onion. So, you know, slicing something like a shallot might work better in the finished recipe than slicing red onion. That one you might want to miss. Oh, I hope I don't start like tearing up and crying all over my kraut. Oh, that's probably going to happen. Okay. Red onion shallot goes into the bowl. I really like the flavor of red onion and shallot. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more because I know I like mine to have a strong onion flavor. For me, what I also get really excited about with making fermented vegetables is there is, you know, no way digestively, tears are coming, that I could handle eating this if it wasn't fermented. You know, a bowl of raw cabbage with raw onion in it would just digestively, for me, not work out so well. I'd probably feel quite just uncomfortable in about an hour. But what's amazing with fermenting vegetables is it makes them easier to digest. And so all of a sudden now I can eat something like onion and cabbage, other crucifers, without having any indigestion from eating it. Okay, onion in the bowl. Once you've got it in there, give it a good little toss around. Mix it up to distribute it. And then we're gonna let that onion flavor start to infuse. I've kept a little bit out so that I can do a little taste, see if it's the right amount of flavor. Always nice to add less and then add if you want more. Okay. Next strong ingredient that I'm going to add is the lime rind. Now, I'm a massive fan of lime flavor, which for me in this recipe, based on using one medium-sized cabbage, I'm typically adding the rind and a bit of the pith, the green part, and a little bit of the white part of 2 limes for me to get the level of lime flavor that I like. I may be a little over the top in this aspect. So you might want to start with the skin of 1 lime and then go from there. But already, just as I'm like zesting this, I'm already falling in love with the lime. Lime rind goes in. We will also be adding the juice, but I'm starting with the rind since that's where the most intense flavor of the citrus comes out. So I want to get that in there just to make sure that I've got the right amount and that it's going to be the flavor that I want in the end. Now, I'll be conservative with you and start with 1 lime, just in case. Next, stronger ingredient that's going to go in here is our hot pepper. Now, for the hot pepper, depending on the level of heat, you may want to put on gloves if your skin is sensitive to peppers. Certainly something like a jalapeno, it generally isn't too intense on the hands, but if you have something that's quite a bit hotter than that, then you might want to wear gloves. And no matter what type of hot pepper you have, just remember you're going to try not to touch your eyes or your face, wash your hands before going to the bathroom. But for the hot pepper, I like heat. I'm keeping my seeds in. If you want some level of spice, but not too much, you can keep the seeds out. The seeds are generally where the most intense heat comes from in the pepper. And if you are using a larger pepper, like I'm just slicing mine into little rounds, but if you have something bigger like a jalapeno, then you might be mincing yours. If you've got a lot of the membrane on the inside, you could remove that membrane. Generally, the texture isn't quite as nice once it softens in a ferment. Oh, goodness. This is starting to smell so delicious. Folks who are making this with me, are you getting excited by how this smells? Which, like for me, again, it's just so wonderful to make your own kraut because you can really create the flavors that you love, right? Like if you're suffering through your ferment, like you're eating it because it's good for me, it's healthy, I'm supposed to. It's not the same thing as being really excited to grab that ferment out of the fridge and to be able to eat it and be excited enough to want to like eat it straight out of the jar. Like that's what we're aiming for in the recipes that we're making. And I hope you love this one as much as I do. It's one of my favorite krauts to introduce people to because I find it so dynamic. Now, the last ingredient that we're going to add is the one that's the least aromatic, which just allows everything else in the bowl to continue to infuse its flavors throughout. The last ingredient that we have is carrot. I have 2 carrots on the recipe card. I just happened to see this carrot at my grocery store and it looks sad because it was broken in half and it's really big. And I thought, well, take it home and I'll use it. So I've just got a half of a massive carrot. Now I'm going to peel the skin off. You could also just wash it and leave the skin on. That's of course also totally fine. The skin does tend to be the spot that's a little bit more bitter. So if you are using an older carrot or a larger carrot, or if you're going to be maybe giving this to people who are really sensitive to the flavor of bitter, like young children, then you might take the skin off just so they like it better. For the carrot, lots of different options, but I do find that a finer piece of carrot works a little bit better in this recipe. Versus like doing a big round or a big spear. Doesn't work quite as well, I find, in the final product. Options could be to julienne, like do little matchsticks of the carrots. That works really well. It's just a little bit loud if I do that on my cutting board for you. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to use my vegetable peeler and I'm just going to do strips. Just creating like little strips of carrot, which can also sometimes just be a nice fast shortcut to have little pieces of carrot. You could also use a box grater on the coarse setting. If you're using a food processor or like a veggie chopper, you could also use the coarse attachment for that. Now, the carrot is in there. We'll do a final mix of everything together. And this is where we really want to do a final taste test to see what else you want to add. Excuse the crunch. So much more lime. I'm going to go ahead and zest the skin of this second lime off. Yeah. And then I'm going to cut one of my limes in half. And, if you don't have a reamer, you could roll it out first to break the membranes inside and then squeeze it on top. I have a reamer, so I'm going to use my reamer. And also add some of the lime juice. Now, when you're adding citrus juice to ferments, a lot of the flavor will be lost. It doesn't really hold up so well, which is why if I want the actual flavor of lime or another citrus like orange or lemon, I always add some of the rind to a ferment so that the finished product actually has some of the flavor of the citrus that I want in there. Now, I also need to add a little bit more salt. It doesn't taste quite salty enough to me, so I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more in there. And the flavor of the curtido is going to stay the same in the sense that however much heat that you have from hot peppers, that's not going to get less spicy as it ferments. Or the level of salt that you had, it's not going to get more or less salty as it ferments. Which means that you want to like the flavor now. Gosh, so good. I hope you're also enjoying this if you're making it with me right now. And I think I might want slightly more salt. Not true? It's true. Now, what is going to change in the flavor as this ferments is those lactic acid bacteria are going to start to create lactic acid. They're going to transform the sugars that are in the vegetables, and they're going to start making lactic acid. And that is going to start to give that characteristic sour, tangy, acidic flavor as it ferments. And so you want to think about when you're making a kraut of some kind, that you're then going to add that tangy flavor of the sourness to it, which if I were going to eat this right now, more like just a Curtido slaw, I would be adding a little bit more vinegar or a little bit more lime juice to add that acidity to the recipe. But we don't need to do that here because that acidity is going to develop in fermentation. Okay, now this is the kind of last stage now before we then go on to packing it in our ferment jars. Questions on this stage? Silva, could I get you to maybe just check for me there?
Absolutely, we do have a few questions, so this is great. So of course you got a great shout out. Thank you so much for teaching us. And then there's a student that would like to know if your upcoming class is live in class or online.
So the ferment course is November Wednesday evening, 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern time. We'll be doing it live like this, but it won't be a panelist setup. It'll be a classroom setup, which means that I'll be watching you as you're making stuff. We'll be doing it together, step by step, easy to ask questions along the way. For those who can't attend live, you'll have the recording sent to you, and then you'll just be sending me your questions through email. Each week we'll have a different focus. So week 1 is fermented drinks, kefir, kombucha. We'll be making our own red wine vinegar, which is very exciting. Week 2 is fermented vegetables. So going over Kraut style, also how to do brined vegetables and all the different ways that we can make kimchi or fermented salsa or whole pieces of vegetable. Week 3, we get into miso, fermenting herbs. We get into making kimchi. Last session, we get all into condiments. So this is when we're looking at mustards, fermented horseradish, a fermented garlic paste, which is so a staple in my life now. I never run out of it. So that's kind of the basic flow of that course.
That's great. I think it was also just making sure like it's all through Zoom, so it's not actually in your studio with you.
Yeah, exactly. It's all through Zoom. So sorry if that wasn't clear. It's not in person. It's live, similar to this setup. You'd be making it in your own kitchen, and by the end of the course, your own kitchen is going to be like stocked up with all different kinds of ferments as we go along.
Amazing. There's a question here. I'm sorry, I missed the reasons why they get moldy. Mine always does and frustrates me. Is it lack of salt or something else?
So 2 big reasons why generally mold is happening when we make krauts. One is that we don't have enough brine to completely cover what it is that we're fermenting for the whole period of time while it ferments. So any air being able to get on a piece of vegetable can be a little island for a mold spore to start to take over, which means that we don't just need enough brine once we put this curtido or kraut, whatever it is that you're making, into the jar just to cover. We need some additional brine because it might take several days fermenting at room temperature, which if you've got some evaporation, so let's say your house is kind of dry and you end up having your brine level go down to evaporation, and now all of a sudden you have some exposed vegetable, now all of a sudden it's going to be prone to getting mold developing on it. Second reason might be not enough salt. This would especially be true with sweeter types of vegetables or vegetables that aren't actually technically vegetables, but they're really fruits, like bell peppers are technically a fruit, cucumber technically a fruit. These are higher sugar. If you're doing peppers on their own, or if you're doing cucumbers on their own, the higher amount of sugar naturally in that vegetable is going to speed up fermentation. It's going to make it more likely that yeast thrive. You can slow that down by adding more salt. And that's why typically, and we'd go over this in the course, but typically whenever I'm doing anything where it's a higher sugar vegetable, I'm increasing my salt ratio, and we'll get specific on ratios and that kind of thing. But for now, just like higher salt would be better with sweeter vegetables. Third reason, which is the kind of third and last big reason that I typically see for why people get molds, is that it doesn't get acidic enough before you transfer it to storage. So we want it, as it's fermenting over the next few days, to build up sufficient acidity so that it is then preserved. And fermenting foods has been done by humans for over 10,000 years, they estimate. Like it's a long time that we've been fermenting as a way to preserve foods. But the preservation works through that lower pH or that acidity, which means that, if let's say on day 3, it's not quite acidic enough and you already transfer it to the fridge for storage, now it's like you've just got coleslaw in your fridge. Like eventually that will mold. You need it while it's fermenting to get a pH that's low enough so that when you put it in your fridge, it's going to keep indefinitely, just like a pickled vegetable would, because you've developed that pH. As you get more familiar with fermenting, you're literally going to be able to tell by taste if it's acidic enough. I can often kind of go up to a ferment as it's fermenting and just smell it. No, it's not done yet.
Yeah.
I can't smell enough acidity yet. But if you're unsure of that, you can also use pH strips, and you're looking for at least under a 4.6 before you transfer to storage in the fridge. So those would be kind of the 3 places I might start with.
Amazing. It's such a wealth of knowledge you have, Kathrin. We have someone who's asking if they hope you didn't, did you use the whole lime? I noticed you did not, but you went back to using the lime after. So I think that was where that was. The next is a comment. My mouth is watering, yummy, and I'm the same way. Like I can actually I love the lime, so I would be right with you. I'd be adding the more lime, the better. The next question is, I usually make sauerkraut, and when it comes out great, but the last time I made it, the brine turned to slime. I've seen mold but never thick slime. Do you know what could have happened?
Yeah, that's calm yeast, my friend. Oh, so we're going to talk about calm yeast a lot. Calm yeast can tend to form, especially if it's again a sweeter type of ferment, so a vegetable that might have a higher sugar content, typically hot sauces, chili pastes. Similarly, if you're making like a pickled cucumber, like a dill pickle by fermentation, they're often very susceptible to calm yeast. It's not harmful. You can eat it. It will do nothing to you. It's completely harmless. It does, however, though, change the texture. It makes it slimy. It makes it more viscous. If there's a brine, there might be some stringiness. I just find it's not super palatable. You can sometimes in a ferment, so let's say it's on the counter fermenting and you notice calm. Sometimes if you let it ferment a little bit longer, eventually the bacteria take over, you get enough acidity in it that it kills the calm yeast off, and it ends up being okay. Sometimes though, you're kind of left with just that viscous feeling in the kraut, which like I don't love eating it. So, I don't typically want to consume it. What I would do with a batch of otherwise tasty kraut that just happened to get a calm infestation on it is I would dehydrate that and then grind it into a powder. And fermented like kraut dehydrated powder, like adding that to recipes is just like absolutely phenomenal, and you wouldn't notice the calm yeast in that. So that could be a way to still use it without having to just pitch it in the compost bin.
Amazing. We've just got 2 more questions. The next one is, this is my first exposure to fermented foods. How different is it from pickles?
Ooh, so there's some similarities, there's some differences. Now, for those who are making along with me, I'm just going to start to pack the kraut into my jars, just so I have enough time to show you what it looks like at the end. You can do it with me if you're also making it at the same time, or you can, wait and do it later. So a pickled vegetable would be one where we're adding an acid, and you're needing to use an acid that's sufficiently strong, which is a pickling vinegar. That's going to have a higher percentage of acetic acid based on the volume of liquid, which does make it kind of strong. Certainly for me, I find with pickled vegetables that acidity sometimes can feel a little bit harsh or a little bit strong. I also find that with pickling vinegar, because it's generally white vinegar that they use, which is acetic acid, it has a really sharp tang flavor to it that isn't incredibly nice. So if I were to compare, say, pickles that I made, so let's say cucumber pickles, via fermentation or via using a pickling vinegar, I really like the nuances of the flavor in fermentation. You get a lot more different aromatics that are created in the fermentation process. The other thing that's typically also an issue I find, so if you're packing with me, I'm just putting in a little at a time. And then if you can get your hand in the jar, you can use your hand to push it down. Otherwise, you could use something like a muddling spoon or like the back of I don't know, if you have like a blender that has a tamper in it, you can use that. But you want to just limit any air pockets. So I'm just making sure there's no visible big holes or gaps there as I fill it up. With white vinegar that they typically use, so let's say you're buying a pickle, it's a little bit unknown what it's made out of. So typically white vinegars can be made with like industrial wood pulp leftovers that they distill, which I don't know about you, but I don't want to eat industrial wood pulp. So I generally like to avoid white pickling vinegars unless they're actually telling me where it's come from and it's a good source. The other thing that I would say, like maybe flavor wise, that's a little bit different as well, is that often if you're getting a pickle, let's say from a store, typically a pickling brine will have the vinegar in it, but they will also use quite a bit of sugar. So there might be a higher sugar content in, say, a store-bought pickled versus a fermented item. And then, of course, there's the health benefits. So although pickling, you'll also have acids that help to break the food down, which might make it a little bit easier to digest. You're not making any beneficial like bacteria or yeast through fermentation. And typically with pickled vegetables, if they're not, being done at home, if they're being bought in a store, they're also pasteurized to have longer shelf life. So any type of, healthy microbes that would have been on that vegetable would have been killed off intentionally to sterilize the food. Where here we're doing the opposite. We're letting microbes thrive and their populations are going up. And that's where we're getting some of that amazing health benefit. So not only are we creating fermentation to help break things down and make it easier to digest. So, all of a sudden this fermented curtido, I can eat it by the forkful and I feel amazing afterwards, no indigestion, which means that I'm getting the health benefit of eating brassica family and eating the onion and all of the wonderful, nutrients that we've got in whatever it is that we're fermenting. But you're also making probiotic bacteria and yeast, and those have a really amazing evidence for having a strong transitory benefit in your body. So as they're moving through your whole digestive tract, they're doing beneficial things. They're helping your immune system. They've been shown to be beneficial for balancing the gut-brain axis, which is why there's a lot of evidence that they help to improve our stress resiliency, reduce depression, help with emotional reactivity. So there's just such endless benefits to getting also the different microbes that you're making through fermentation, which, I also think is a great way to naturally, like in your own kitchen, make beneficial probiotics as opposed to, having to buy a supplement, which again, might have some like questionable origins in it or might not have the same diversity of microbes that our kraut will. So if you're buying a store-bought probiotic supplement, there might be a high count. You might be getting something in the billions, but the strain diversity isn't going to be very big. Maybe there's 5, 10 different strains. Whereas with something like a fermented kraut like this, we'd also be getting into the billions in terms of count in a teaspoon or so of our fermented kraut, but you'd have much more strain diversity. So if you're eating kraut today and you're eating your fermented rhubarb, and then you're eating your tomato salsa, maybe you're having some miso, you've made your own vinegar, all of a sudden you've got strain diversity in the hundreds, and considering that humans for our whole evolution up until very recently were consuming fermented foods as a big part of their diet. I think, consuming them again as part of our diet and a diversity of them, it's no wonder it's so beneficial for our health. It's how we evolved.
Amazing. So why don't I have one more question, and then we'll kind of move on to, and then we'll save the rest for the last batch. How does that sound?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Sylvan.
Perfect. So the final question for this section is, do you ever put herbs in kraut?
Yes, I do. I'm definitely a huge fan of putting fresh herbs in krauts. Tons of dill with cabbage. So just like a basic cabbage with a ton of dill is an excellent, amazing, versatile recipe to make. And it's really friendly in terms of a lot of people will like it. Kind of just tastes like you're eating a dill pickle. So that's a really great one. You also get a lot of benefit from fermenting herbs. In terms of increasing their benefit, in terms of releasing the antioxidant in a way that your body can use. And think about how many supplements that you might buy that have a fermented form of a herb in it to make it more bioavailable. So in the same way, if there's an herb that you want to use, ginger, turmeric, cardamom, whatever it is, by fermenting it, you might be boosting its bioavailability. So it's another great way to almost think about making your supplements in the kitchen through the magic of fermentation, making these nutrients more bioavailable for us. And so if you are making along with me, you want to fill your jar, but not right to the top. So if you have, just take a little bit out. You want to just check and see that you've packed everything in. There's no big air gaps. And then I've already got quite a bit of brine in there. If you've got brine in your bowl, you want to pour the brine in. And now we want to create a follower and a weight on top so that as it ferments, there's no places where there's a piece of vegetable that's now exposed to the air, making that little island for mold. What I recommended, low tech way, so that piece of cabbage that we set aside, which was our clean cabbage, that can just go in, and that acts as what's called a follower, which just means that it's following on top to keep any small pieces of vegetables that might come up to the top submerged underneath. And then we need a weight because we want everything to stay underneath the brine, which the reason that I recommend, if you've got a wide mouth jar, just placing another jar that's smaller in diameter inside, that could be your weight. And then we just press down until the brine is over top. I have here, you can get glass fermenting weights. These can be handy. If you're going to get into fermenting a lot, I would recommend picking up a set. You can get them for the size of either a regular mouth or a wide mouth canning jar. And what's nice is they then just fit the diameter of your jar, and they act as both the follower and the weight. So you don't need to always have a piece of cabbage leaf or something. You can just pop the whole thing in, follower and the weight all at the same time. Now, we're going to set this aside now to ferment, and how long it's going to take to ferment really depends on the temperature of your house. The warmer your home, the faster it will ferment. The cooler your home, the longer it will take. This could be anywhere from 4 to 12 days, I would say, is a good range to start. What you're going to start to notice as it ferments, one, the salt is going to continue to pull more water out of the vegetables. So I always recommend place your ferment in a shallow dish, because by tomorrow you might have an overflow of brine coming out of the jar. The other thing that you'll start to see is by day 2, 3, 4, you're going to start to see CO2 bubbles, carbon dioxide bubbles. So as those lactic acid bacteria are making lactic acid, they're also creating carbon dioxide. If you were to press down on your weight, you'll actually see carbon dioxide bubbles coming up, and that's a really great sign that fermentation is happening. Later on in the ferment, maybe day 5, 7, 9, you're going to start to smell that acidity. You're also, because we've done brassica, crucifer, you're going to start to smell that sulfur releasing. So not only is it going to smell tangy, it's going to smell a little bit farty. So I do apologize for the smell in your kitchen. It's all worth it. And that smell is also going to be in the taste. So if on day 5, 6, 7, you're really smelling that strong, sour, tangy smell, that might be the point where you lift up, take your weight off, lift up your follower, take a fork and taste it. If it tastes pleasingly acidic, it's got a good sour tang, then you're ready to put it in the fridge for long-term storage. If it's only slightly acidic, we want to let it go a little bit longer, right? Again, pH strip, looking for underneath of 4.6. Once it's acidic enough, then you can remove the follower, remove the weight, put a lid on it. Now it goes into the fridge where the acids are going to preserve it. So it's not going to go bad. Like you could keep this like Curtido in your fridge for a year and pull it out, and it's still perfectly safe to eat, which is why fermentation is such an amazing way of preserving the harvest. But the acidity is going to continue to break down the vegetables, which means that, you know, a year-old Curtido Kraut that you pull out, it's going to be really soft in texture, you know, which again, I prefer crunchier vegetables. So I'm going to try and consume this within about 6 to 8 weeks, ideally for that like maximum crunch, but it's still going to be wonderful in your fridge after 3 months. Okay, so that's kind of our whole process, easy peasy. Now we just wait and let it ferment. Other thing I'll just show you in terms of the other thing that you'll see that's visibly different. This jar is also Curtido Kraut, and you might be able to see there that the colors are a little bit less vibrant, and I might actually come around to the front just so it's a little bit easier to see that. But as they ferment, vegetables will lose some of their brightness. They're going to turn a duller color. Greens are going to turn into olives. You know, bright oranges will get a little bit duller orange, and that's totally normal. That's just the acids breaking things down. So that's another thing that's totally okay to see and a sign that you've fermented it correctly. Curtido Kraut, there we go. All right, questions?
Excellent. Okay, great. I will open up the chat. There's a question here asking about vinegar. Do you put vinegar into the kraut, or do you put it into the jar? So there's no vinegar added, correct?
No vinegar added.
No vinegar.
Vinegar would be added if we were pickling. We're not adding vinegar when we're fermenting. We're letting the acids build up through fermentation.
Perfect. Next question is, the bacteria will come naturally from the air and from the vegetables themselves.
Primarily when we're doing vegetable fermentation, the fermenting microbes, so our lab bacteria, they come from the vegetables. And that's not just the outside of the vegetable, it's actually within the vegetable itself. It's covering everything. And that's where we're getting those lactobacillus bacteria, which, you know, this is also where, again, we want something that's fresher, you know, so ideally when we're fermenting, we're taking this year's harvest, which, you know, I think this is such an incredible time of year to start fermenting, because this is when we've got so much stuff in the farmer's market that's just ready to be fermented. And then you can enjoy it all year long, preserving that amazing flavor and nutrition until next year's vegetables are ready again at the farmer's market or wherever you're getting your veggies.
Excellent. The question, and I guess this kind of also goes into timing. So the question is, did you put a lid on yet? So I guess when would you put the lid on? After you kind of wait 4 to 12, is that 4 to 12 days?
Yeah, so it's going to depend a little bit on what's happening in your kitchen. If you've got a fruit fly situation happening, then what you might do, so I'm going to put my weight on there again, is just take a clean cloth and place it on top just to keep them out. If you are wanting to put a lid on it, you have to remember that you're building carbon dioxide as it ferments, which means that pressure is building inside the jar. So if you did have a weight, like I've got my glass weight in there now, I could in theory put a lid on. I have space to, but I'd be building CO2 inside this jar. So I would have to remember every couple days to burp the jar, which just means like releasing the pressure out, or you could just leave it loose on it so that the air can escape, but you do need to release that carbon dioxide, which is why I didn't place a lid on. I don't have any fruit flies right now, so I'm actually just going to leave it like this to ferment. I'm not going to cover it at all.
Sure. The next question is, should we put it in the fridge or outside after opening the store-bought cucumber, pickles, and bell pepper jar?
Sorry, so if you're buying like store-bought pickles, would you leave it out? So if you're buying store-bought pickles, you can no longer get those to ferment. So if I were to open a jar of like big pickles, even if I left them now at room temperature, they wouldn't be able to ferment because those have been pasteurized. So there's no bacteria anymore if they weren't pasteurized. So let's say it's a pickle that is an actual non-pasteurized pickle, or even a fermented pickle. So let's say you bought fermented pickles. If you were now to open them at home and want that fermentation process to continue, you might not have a lot of change depending on where it is in that journey, because the original bacteria or lactic acid bacteria, they need to eat the sugars to survive. So they're going to start to create lactic acid. As the pH changes, you're changing which microbes are going to thrive. So you'll have other types of bacteria will start to get active, beneficial yeast will start to get active, and that kind of all shifts in the age of the ferment. So if you've got something that's already a finished ferment, yeah, you can expose it to air. If it's like still got living microbes in it, that process might continue, but it's not going to be the same as starting from scratch. And it might continue in a way that's not particularly pleasing to taste or pleasing to texture.
Sure.
I hope that makes sense. If I didn't quite understand the question, just let me know.
I think so. The next question is, how much should we eat daily?
So my recommendation, a small amount of fermented food contains a really high count of microbes. So certainly if you're new to fermented foods, I would say start small. A spoon or two a day is plenty in terms of the health benefits. Typically, though, those of us who really get into fermenting, we start to love the flavor and I'm not stopping at just a forkful. So it's totally okay to eat more than that if you're accustomed to it. Starting too much right off the bat, if your system's not used to it, you might actually get a little bit of even possibly diarrhea, or it might not agree with your system that much. So I would say start small. In terms of once you've been eating fermented foods, I would say just, a small amount every day. In terms of the best health benefits, I would maybe also just add a little asterisk that ideally you're eating a variety of types of fermented foods. So maybe you're having your Curtido on Monday, you're having some miso on Tuesday, you're having some of your homemade kombucha on Wednesday, which means that you're going to increase the diversity of species that you're exposed to.
Sure. And there's one final question. How many days before putting it into the fridge?
Again, it's going to depend a little bit on the temperature of your house. The warmer your house, the faster the ferment. If I was doing this in my kitchen in July or August, this might be ready in 6 days. It's cooler in my house now. So, I'm going to guess it'll probably take about 10 to 12 days. But again, similar to salt, you got to do it to taste. Similar to the fermentation time, you have to just smell it and taste it. If you're unsure, use a pH strip. If you've got my email, you're welcome to email me and send me a question and I can try and guide you through it. But that is where I feel like it's nice to learn how to ferment in a community with people who know how to do it, because they can help to kind of coach you through some of those, is this ready? I'm not quite sure, which is why we kind of imbue that in the course and do it week by week, so we can keep checking back on what we've already made and seeing how in every single person's house it's going to turn out slightly differently, because there's different temperatures, you've got different microbes in your house, there's all these little different factors that come into it. But trust your taste, trust your smell. Once it's pleasingly acidic, try putting it in the fridge.
Sure. And then the next question is, there was one more. Sorry, where can we follow you on Instagram?
I am horrible at posting regularly, but yes, absolutely. I am on Instagram and I do respond to things. I'm just very lazy with posting, but you can find me on there. I also have a website, which is also fortheloveofbody.com. You'll find lots of other recipes for ferments on there as well. So if you want to dive in and make other vegetables, or if you want to try, let's say, chaga tea kombucha, there's lots of different recipes on there that you can also explore.
Wonderful. And actually, there is a final remark that I think really sums everything up from another Kathrin, who says, "You're the best, Kathrin. We appreciate your time and you." And I think that speaks for us all.
Thanks, Kathrin. I'm so glad you were able to make it. And thank you everyone for coming. I didn't really get to chance, I'm far away from my screen, but I saw some names earlier. Michael, Helen, thank you. Wissal, nice to see people, names that I recognize. Thanks for spending time with me, and I hope your kraut turns out. And again, always, I love questions, so send me an email if you have any.
Wonderful. And can you just repeat your website? It's fortheloveofbody.com, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It was just a wonderful webinar, and we're just so thankful for Kathrin for giving her time and teaching us. And you can find more information about Kathrin's course online at the Institute of Holistic Nutrition.com. And then this webinar will also be on YouTube, so we'll be able to continue to learn and develop our Krauts recipes going forward. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Have a wonderful
for hosting. Thank you, everyone.